Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Esta conferencia, que ya va en su tercera versión, es organizada por la Escuela de Comunicaciones y Periodismo de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez y Cultura Social Media, laboratorio de investigación desde el cual analizamos y difundimos las implicancias de la comunicación digital en la vida social, política y económica. Welcome everyone to the last day of the Social Media Culture Conference, which this year's topic is the role of emerging technologies to face uncertain futures. This activity is organized by the School of Communications and Journalism at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez and the Social Media Culture Research Lab. For people abroad, you can activate the English translation below the screen on Zoom in the world icon, and you can hear the translation. Now in Spanish. A continuación, Magdalena Brown, decana de la Escuela de Comunicaciones y Periodismo, nos dará la bienvenida y nos invitará a la sesión de hoy.
Hola a todos y a todas, bienvenidos. Bueno, como contaba Arturo, estamos ya en nuestro tercer día de esta conferencia, de nuestra conferencia internacional Cultura Social Media, Tecnologías Emergentes ante Futuros Inciertos. Tal vez como nunca este año, la tecnología nos ha posibilitado que esta conferencia se abra a participantes y audiencias de distintas partes del mundo. Nuevamente, la tecnología nos ha permitido comunicarnos y vivir una experiencia común con otros, que están físicamente distantes. Discutir justamente sobre la potencialidad que nos trae la comunicación y las tecnologías es de lo que trata esta conferencia, y cómo en su desarrollo los humanos, los grupos sociales, la sociedad se van redefiniendo a sí mismos y sus relaciones con el entorno. En nuestra jornada pasada, la del día lunes, el primer día de esta conferencia, hablamos de cómo nuestros vínculos sociales fuertes del tipo familiar y amistades y el ejercicio de la ciudadanía son redefinidos por el desarrollo digital. Ayer, en el segundo día de nuestra conferencia, reflexionamos sobre cómo la robótica social nos obliga a interrogarnos sobre qué es la comunicación y cómo ésta define nuestra humanidad. Hoy, nuestro foco estará puesto en el mundo del trabajo y la producción de contenidos digitales, pero las preguntas son similares. ¿Cómo las nuevas prácticas digitales redefinen nuestra forma de organizarnos y relacionarnos en sociedad? La industria en torno a la creación de contenido en plataformas digitales mueve año a año billones de dólares. Esta industria, impulsada por creadores de contenidos como youtubers, tiktokers, influencers, instagramers y plataformas que gestionan la visibilidad y transmisión de estos contenidos, están redefiniendo las formas de consumo, las distinciones entre información y entretención, así como los modelos de negocio de las industrias culturales a nivel global. Esta línea de investigación ha tomado fuerza en nuestra escuela a través del trabajo que se desarrolla y que antes mencionó Arturo en Cultura Social Media, el laboratorio de investigación en comunicación digital, que entre otros temas observa y ha estado explorando cómo la industria de los creadores de contenido en Chile y en otras latitudes hacen y su forma y sus estilos de comunicación van generando cambios de cultura que están reflejados al uso de tecnologías digitales. En esta nueva versión de la conferencia Cultura Social Media, contamos justamente con dos grandes expositores que nos permitirán seguir ahondando sobre estas temáticas y que vienen analizando las implicancias sociales, económicas y culturales de estas nuevas prácticas comunicativas. Ellos son David Craig, profesor de la Universidad de Southern California, y Alison Hare, profesora de la Universidad de Western Ontario. Justamente hoy, en la sesión que tendremos en algunos momentos más, David Craig analizará la industria de creadores de contenido digital en China en particular, referido a celebridades y microcelebridades online e intermediarios que en conjunto configuran una industria del entretenimiento en los medios sociales online. Por su parte, Alison Hare abordará el impacto cultural y económico de estas nuevas formas de producción de contenidos a nivel global y en las formas de comunicación contemporáneas mediadas por plataformas digitales. Con ello, cerraremos así una conferencia internacional que mantiene el espíritu con el cual la inauguramos en su primera versión el 2018. Reflexionar sobre la transformación digital y su impacto social desde la evidencia. Nuestra visión no es determinista en términos tecnológicos. Entendemos que las personas nos apropiamos de las tecnologías, las hacemos nuestras, y es en ese proceso que rearticulamos nuestro modo de ser en el mundo. Aún más, en la medida que nuestras preguntas sobre las tecnologías se formulan desde la comunicación, nuestra reflexión necesariamente se centra en nuestra naturaleza social y humanidad. Ese entendimiento amplio de las comunicaciones como un eje de la transformación social que estamos viviendo en nuestra región y en el mundo nos inspira como Escuela de Comunicaciones en la Universidad de Ibáñez. Puesto muy en simple, creemos en las comunicaciones como una ciencia social interdisciplinaria, con visión de futuro, que aporta desde la evidencia científica y que sobre todo genera impacto social. Muchas gracias a todos y a todos por estar aquí hoy. A nuestros invitados, y en la jornada de hoy quiero agradecer especialmente a Arturo Arriagada, quien partió con esta iniciativa de esta conferencia hace 3 años y con su tesón y rigurosidad ha permitido que todo un equipo sea parte de este proyecto que ha adquirido una escala global. Nuevamente, gracias a nuestros profesores que permitieron nuestras jornadas anteriores, a Carmina Rodríguez y a Luis Enrique Santana. Y también muchas gracias a todo nuestro equipo de escuela y especialmente a quienes están detrás y que hacen posible esta conexión a través de Zoom. Está Jan, está Juan Pablo, está Sebastián, está Maranta, está Valentina, a todo el equipo de comunicaciones de la universidad, a todos ellos. Y nuevamente quiero agradecer a ustedes, a todos los participantes que hacen posible esta experiencia común. Muchas gracias y los dejo con la conferencia.
Muchas gracias, Magdalena. A continuación vamos a ver la presentación de David Craig. Como comentaba Magdalena, David es profesor de la Escuela de Comunicación y Periodismo de la Universidad de Southern California, quien hoy día nos presentará un análisis de la industria de contenidos digitales en China. David, junto a Stuart Cunningham, han publicado el libro Social Media Entertainment en el año 2019, publicado por NYU Press, y el próximo año publicarán el libro Creator Culture con la misma editorial, y en ambos libros ellos mapean la organización y las dinámicas de una nueva industria creativa que opera en la intersección de las industrias del entretenimiento, la interactividad, la comunicación y los contenidos, liderada por millones de usuarios de plataformas como Facebook, Instagram, YouTube y TikTok en todo el mundo. Estos creadores de contenido han aprovechado las plataformas para generar nuevos tipos de contenido que se separan bastante del modelo centenario de control de propiedad intelectual de la industria de los medios de comunicación masiva tradicional, como el cine, la música, la prensa, entre otras. Veamos a continuación la presentación de David Craig.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Craig from USC Annenberg. Thank you, Arturo, for including me in this conference. Today, I'm going to present on Wanghong. Wanghong is a polysemic term from China that refers to celebrities and influencers and creators who are harnessing Chinese social media platforms for value. It is also the title of the third book that I have written with my co-author, Stuart Cunningham from QUT in Australia, along with an extraordinary young new scholar named Jian Lin, who is at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. In the first book, co-author with Stuart Cunningham, called Social Media Entertainment, we described and mapped the contours and dimensions of a brand new screen industry that operates with vast distinction from established media industries like film, television, music, or publishing. What most distinguished this industry was how a wave of new cultural producers, we call them creators, you may refer to them as influencers or vloggers or game players, have managed to harness social media platforms in order to engage and aggregate massive fan communities, and they convert these into cultural and commercial value. In our second book called Creator Culture, Stuart Cunningham and I brought together a number of leading scholars who were also examining and researching and studying social media entertainment. We see this as an emerging subfield of study across disciplines, fields, and methodologies. This book will be released by NYU Press in the spring. Our third book, coming out from Palgrave later in 2021, is called Wong Hong. This refers to China's separate social media entertainment industry. As with social media entertainment, we mapped the contours and dimensions of this industry across multiple frameworks and perspectives. But unlike social media entertainment, where we did not engage with a great deal of information around policy, in order to understand the Wong Hong industry, one must start and end with Chinese state regulation. Underlying state regulation and policy have provided the conditions for which this industry has not only flourished, but has now become a driver of China's entire digital economy. For 2 decades now, China has introduced policies and regulations to convert their entire economy into a digital economy. That's every industry, every market, every sector is meant to operate online across Chinese-run platforms. As this chart reflects, China's transformation to a digital economy has been remarkable, and their digital economy now surpasses the US digital economy at around $29 trillion as of this year. In addition to their economic policy, their telecommunications policy has encouraged China's citizens to all go online, particularly through mobile phone technology. As this slide reflects, their internet use has gone from 300 to 800 million users. Their mobile phone with internet access has gone from 100 to 800 million users. This is roughly 2/3 of their entire population. And finally, their platform policy has been tremendously successful at not only blocking out and censoring Western platforms, but at incubating their own platforms. Referred to as the Great Firewall of China, China has blocked out Western, particularly Silicon Valley-based platforms inside the country. While blocking outside platforms, China has nurtured a platform landscape inside China that is even more diverse, competitive, collaborative, and more technologically advanced than in the West. The following is a brief evolution of Wong Hong platforms, which refers to those platforms that Wong Hong creators are using in order to generate value. Initially, Chinese social media platforms were considered to be imitators of the West. Youku was the YouTube of China. Weibo was the Twitter of China. But over the last 15 to 20 years, these platforms have changed dramatically. Youku is now closer to Netflix, and Weibo includes a number of features that Twitter has never introduced. Compared to the West, Chinese social media platforms are much better integrated with competing platforms from other tech companies. So, for example, e-commerce platforms from Alibaba to Taobao to Pinduoduo and JD.com are available to be introduced into all the other social media platforms throughout this entire landscape. Online mobile payment services like WeChat Pay or Alipay may be used across a number of platforms that are owned by competing tech companies. WeChat is an example of a super app upon which users can conduct almost every possible type of activity, whether it's making phone calls or messengering, ordering a taxi, buying products, purchasing food, purchasing plane tickets. Almost every type of activity can be conducted within WeChat itself. Most notably, China has developed a series of what we call social apps. This includes live streaming apps comparable to Twitch, but whereas there are only a handful of live streaming apps in the West, China has over 100 successful live streaming apps and platforms that have introduced live streaming, including dating apps. In addition, China has launched this state-of-the-art generation of what's referred to as social video apps or short video apps like Douyin, which is their version of TikTok, and Kuaishou. These are apps that have created a user interface in which everyone can not only upload content readily, but can discover other content much more easily and in a more superior form of algorithmic activity than we've seen in the West. In the latest evolution of Wong Hong platforms, Chinese tech companies are launching parallel platforms similar to their Chinese-owned platforms outside their borders. The best example, of course, would be ByteDance, which owns a number of Chinese platforms, including a platform called Douyin or TikTok inside China. Then there is a second TikTok outside China, which most of you have heard about from the news. Chinese policy and regulation, along with the rapid and accelerated evolution of these social media platforms in China, have created the underlying conditions upon which creators, influencers, cultural producers, entrepreneurs, bloggers, and game players have emerged. Much like in the West, China has a number of terms for creators. One of the first terms that became popular was key opinion leaders, or KOLs. These were often pre-established cultural producers, filmmakers, musicians, authors who migrated over to social media so they could interact directly with their readers, their fans, and their communities. Wang Hong has many definitions and meanings. More often, the term is used to describe beauty influencers selling products through e-commerce stores on their platforms, but it has come to describe this entire industry as well. There are a number of new terms that continue to be introduced, like Zubo, which translates as showroom host, but more specifically refers to those creators using live streaming platforms. The first generation of Wang Hong creators were often developing original intellectual properties that resembled television, although not necessarily Chinese television, which has been until recently fairly dated in terms of its formats and its genres. Bao Cao Manhua was a sketch comedy show, and Luo Ji on the bottom was a talk show very different from traditional Chinese talk shows. Animation has been a very popular vertical in the Wang Hong industry. Companies like Ferie Shuo and animators like Uncle Tang Dao were able to launch not only their own animation on these social media platforms, but then convert these into other properties, whether it's books, merchandise, toys, or in the case of Uncle Tang Dao, a chain of bakeries. Jiang Jia and Papi Jiang are two of the most influential creators in the Wang Hong industry. Jiang Jia was a frustrated actor who managed to find and build his own community online, and then turned around and became the writer, producer, and star of his own film. Papi Jiang was a Chinese vlogger who spoke directly into the screen in a very humorous way, offering commentary about modern China. Much like in the West, which features a number of very successful game players like Markiplier and Ninja, in China, game players have also become extremely successful, operating across competing gameplay platforms, often afforded very lucrative salaries to play, which is on top of the tips that they earn from their fans who are watching. Zhang Dayi is an example of a beauty creator. This is a lifestyle creator who promotes and sells products and services and brands through her e-commerce store and generates millions of dollars worth of revenue a year. Fong Timo is an example of a beautiful creator. This is not someone who sells products and services so much as she sells time for lonely men in particular to hang out with her for hours a day and reward her through virtual goods. Now let's discuss the size and scale of the Wang Hong economy. For the last 5 years, a number of organizations have published reports that map the size and scale of the Wang Hong economy, and a number of books that describe how to go about launching and running your own Wang Hong business. Much like in the West, Wang Hong creators have developed multiple business models. These include influencer marketing, e-commerce, virtual goods, salaries paid directly by the platforms, and other forms of revenue that are generated offline as well. But to offer you just one example of the breathtaking influence and commercial power of this industry, Via is one of the most successful e-commerce beauty creators, but she doesn't just sell lifestyle brands, she can even sell rocket systems. 5 years ago, the estimates for the Wang Hong economy were around $15 billion, which was equal to China's still growing film industry box office. 5 years later now, estimates are that the Guanghong economy is worth $300 billion. We still consider this estimate to be relatively low, and it's unclear whether or not this is based on influencer marketing, platforms, or the entire breadth of business models that creators are generating across these platforms. In addition to platforms and creators, there are at least 20,000 MCNs. This is a term that refers to management companies that now partner with these Guanghong creators to help negotiate deals with the platforms and with the brands, to help bring in new business models and revenue streams, and to help further advance and accelerate the growth of this entire economy. Selfie cafes have emerged across China, where Guanghong creators can not only purchase baked goods, but live stream in the cafe to their communities, which in turn drives customers to the cafes. Cities throughout China now launch Guanghong festivals. The Douyu live streaming festival in Wuhan, China, had more visitors than the Olympics in its second year, and its live streaming audience numbered over 100 million viewers. Now I want to briefly describe the rise and influence of Guanghong culture. In addition to those cosmopolitan creators from tier 1 and 2 cities who are selling lifestyle brands and rockets, rural villagers now have emerged as very successful creators, reintroducing traditional forms of Chinese culture, comedy, dialect, humor into Guanghong culture. As with all cultural and creative industries, there is tremendous precarity in the Guanghong industry and Guanghong culture. People's Republic of Desire is an almost Black Mirror-like account of the challenges that Guanghong creators face in trying to build sustainable and rewarding careers in this industry. During the COVID-19 crisis, everyone was not only trapped indoors, but also online in China. This included this young guy who left his live streaming account open overnight, and when he woke up in the morning, he had over 340,000 yuan worth of virtual gifts. This is just an example of how the COVID-19 crisis has only further accelerated the growth and influence of the Guanghong industry. Now Guanghong culture is going out. Li Qiqi is an example of a Chinese creator who has a huge following inside China and has converted this into a giant lifestyle brand. But now she has 10 million subscribers on YouTube as well. While the Chinese state has nurtured and accelerated the growth of the Guanghong industry, the government has also been cracking down on Guanghong culture, particularly through forms of censorship. Some of the solid social policies that have been introduced are fairly absurd, like the restrictions on eating fruit erotically across live streaming platforms. But some of the social policies can be quite dire, like shutting down entire platforms that dare to mention controversial subject matter. The government now makes all the platforms responsible for content moderation, which means there are tens of thousands of Chinese people who have been hired to watch every live stream, every video, and every post to make sure that these do not violate Chinese social policies. In response to the growth of Chinese tech platforms and the Guanghong industry outside its borders, we are witnessing a wave of platform nationalism. In India, all Chinese platforms and apps have been banned from their store, and India is moving very quickly to develop their own competing Guanghong social media entertainment industry. On the surface, Donald Trump's attempt to ban and force the sale of TikTok appears like platform nationalism. In truth, this is more platform capitalism. The American company that is supposedly partnering with TikTok to take control of the company in the US is funded by the same venture capital company that has heavily invested in TikTok in China. And that is the end of my presentation. I look forward to your questions.
Muchas gracias, David, por esa presentación. Tal como comentaba, al final del video van a poder realizar las preguntas, todos quienes nos están acompañando acá por el chat. Así que vamos a tener un momento de conversación al final de estas presentaciones. En la presentación que realizó David, analizó en detalle la configuración de un mercado y de una industria en torno a la creación de contenidos en China, una cultura y una organización política e institucional con características particulares. A continuación, Alison Hearn, profesora de la Escuela de Medios y Comunicaciones de la Universidad de Western Ontario, nos presentará un análisis de las cadenas de valor y las relaciones sociales que configuran el mercado de la creación y medición de contenidos en Estados Unidos. Hearn sitúa la autopromoción como el elemento central de la comunicación que realizan influencers, youtubers e instagramers. Esta autopromoción no es más que el resultado, a su juicio, de la proliferación del capitalismo en distintos ámbitos de la vida social. A su juicio, hoy la promoción del yo en plataformas digitales con fines comerciales, como las que describía David y otras, opera como una estrategia de sobrevivencia en mercados cada vez más competitivos. A continuación, los dejo con la presentación de Alison Hearn.
Hola a todos. Estoy muy feliz de estar con ustedes hoy. Muchas gracias por invitarme. Gracias especialmente a la Facultad de Comunicación y Periodismo de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez y especialmente Arturo Arriagada. Okay, well, I'm going to switch into English now. I apologize for my Spanish with a French accent. I'm Canadian, so that's where it comes from. I'm going to try to share my screen with you, and we'll see how that goes. All right, so the current and hopefully outgoing leader of the free world is an inveterate attention seeker and master self-promoter. Beyond the real estate deals, the hotels, the TV shows, Trump's primary obsession has always involved cultivating his reputation and consolidating his personal brand. We saw this all the way through his term as president: the relentless lying, the staged photo ops, the embrace of shock and hatred, even at the risk of harming others, all in pursuit of the attention and the ratings that he craves. Trump claims to have learned the art of self-promotion at his father's knee and is said to have promoted a new building project while giving his father's eulogy. In the 80s and 90s, he masqueraded as his own publicist while actively courting the attention of reporters. Clearly, Trump's skill at reputation management and self-branding provided him with valuable name recognition once he moved into the political arena. And arguably, as the last 4 years have shown, it's really the only viable skill that he has. So Trump is an archetype of an age where money and power follow attention-getting visibility, and everyone, it seems, wants to get in on the act. In the 2000s, reality TV stars like Paris Hilton or Kim Kardashian modeled how to be yourself on TV and get paid doing it. And today, the technological affordances and business models of social media platforms have amplified the gauzy promise that anyone can make a living being themselves and become an influencer. All that's required is the consistent application of effective forms of self-promotion. Indeed, the logics of perpetual reputation seeking and self-promotion permeate all kinds of our social relationships today. Fame, for example, is the #1 aspirational value across the American tween population. Colleges and universities offer seminars on how to successfully self-brand for the job market, while teachers work on their own reputational capital by shilling for tech companies in the classroom. Everyone, from academics to musicians, scientists, to corporate CEOs, assiduously network and self-promote in order to stay relevant and build their reputations and protect their jobs. So against a backdrop of ever-deepening economic and environmental precariousness, where gig work and data extractive platform capitalism are dominant, perpetual networking and self-promotion appear to have become compulsory, enforced, in the words of Gilligan and Vishmit, as a survival discipline. In this time of perpetual connection and high-stakes visibility, then, almost everyone is required to hustle and self-promote, to be a little bit Trump. In my work, I tend to focus on the ways in which our senses of self and our forms of self-presentation are conditioning of and conditioned by the logics of capitalism. And I've generally looked to history to flesh out this inquiry, examining the ways individuals have attempted to use forms of self-presentation to secure their creditability and their economic livelihoods. But today I want to focus on the present and on the ways in which social media content creators are being enclosed by capitalist logics as influencers, and how this influencer culture is becoming increasingly industrialized. And I want to do this by exploring the phenomenon of the content house, also referred to as the collab house, which is short for the collaboration house. Content houses are usually lavish LA mansions that are populated by Generation Z social media influencers looking to amplify their reputational capital by co-creating content in a distinctive collective brand, a house brand, with other influencers. These houses burst onto the public scene in North America recently, this past summer actually, because they held these huge parties in defiance of the lockdown orders during the global pandemic. So public attention has always been the point of these houses, of course. They've been the point since the first of these creator incubators, such as 1600 Vine and Jake Paul's Teen 10 House, initiated a network of these hubs of influencers across Los Angeles in 2014. The recent popularity of TikTok, which reported over 700 million active users in July, seems to have turbocharged the number of these content houses in 2020. Hype House, Sway House, Drip Crib, Kids Next Door, Clubhouse, all have formed in the last 8 months, spreading across Los Angeles, in the words of Cody Ko, like a virus. So what I'm going to present today is only the very beginning of a research project that's looking to explore the emergent yet highly opaque political economic arrangements behind these content houses and the standardized promotional aesthetics that these houses and their occupants display and reinforce. So as crucibles for new forms of influencer marketing, I argue that these houses are portals through which we might begin to map the growing formalization and industrialization of the influencer economy more broadly. Influencers, of course, emerged from the potent intersection of new digital technologies, social media platforms, the entrenchment of branding and promotionalism, and the growing financialization of daily life. So just to get back to basics, I want to start by reminding you that sociologist Andrew Wernick was among the first to theorize the phenomenon of the promotional self in his 1991 book, Promotional Culture. Here, Wernick argues that promotion is a species of rhetoric. It's defined not by what it says, but by what it does. And he says that promotionalism has become a dominant cultural condition. For Wernick, in a promotional culture, what matters most isn't meaning or truth or reason, but winning, attention, emotional allegiance, and market share. As a foundational component of commodity exchange, a promotional culture is thoroughly instrumental. Its function is to bring about some form of self-advantaging exchange. The promotional self, then, is a persona produced for public consumption. It constructs itself for others in line with the competitive imaging needs of the market. These are words of Wernicke's. This, in turn, raises serious questions, then, about our senses of self and our sociality overall. How can we build an identity when, in the words of Wernicke, from the materials of a culture whose meanings are unstable and behind which no genuinely expressive intention can be read, where all our social relationships are infected with doubt? What can authenticity mean in a world where everything, including our self-image, is not only highly mediated, but commoditized as well? How do we trust each other if we're always trying to sell to each other? Wernicke's concerns about the proliferation of promotional discourse and selfhood in the 1990s align with the entrenchment of neoliberalism and finance capitalism as hegemonic. Just here, undergirded by entrenched power relationships and power elites who espouse neoliberal governmental ideologies like protecting free markets and protecting free trade and, voiding the social safety net. Financialization represents a shift in emphasis from the sphere of material production to the sphere of circulation, resulting in a condition that Kostas Lapavitsas has called profiting without producing. Under these conditions, the influence of capital markets, banking, finance sector, and in contemporary economic and political life grow in dominance. And practices of financial speculation come to set the conditions of the development of both non-finance capital and state services. And as a result, we see a more general diffusion of financial logics, discourses, and practices across the economy and culture at large, what Randy Martin has called the financialization of daily life. More recently, Michel Fair and Ivan Asher, among others, following Foucault, argue that neoliberalism and financialization have shifted the meaning of the term human capital from a set of potential capacities related to wage labor to a constant process of self-management, which seeks the investment and endorsement of others. Fair argues that we're exhorted to see ourselves as individual projects looking for investment and to position ourselves as sites for capitalist speculation. Our ability to attract investment, for example, in likes or followers or comments, can in turn act as a hedge against the insecurity of the labor market and the instability of capitalist value in general. So in this way, we become our own reputational asset managers, if you will, managing a portfolio of personal conduct and relationships, which can lead to our social and economic appreciation or depreciation. Of course, the logics of data accumulation that undergird most digital media platforms today demands an expressly promotional performance of selfhood, which not only involves peddling one's own personal brand, but amplifying and investing in affiliated profiles and projects of other people as well. So this world of surveillance capitalism, in Shoshana Zuboff's terms, involves a relentlessly promotional value chain. As we're summoned to provide expressive raw material online in order to access social and economic inclusion, the behavioral surplus that results is subsequently molded into what Zuboff calls prediction products and traded in behavioral future markets that work to optimize, direct, and discipline us ever more rigorously. So as mentioned, the position of the influencer is totally paradigmatic of these forms of promotional and financialized selfhood that Fair and Asher and Zuboff and others have described. Their very existence is a byproduct of the commercial, profit-driven logics that structure social media platforms on which they circulate. These logics demand perpetual connection, visibility, and sociality to keep the advertiser dollars rolling and the data coming in, because that's really what the social media platforms want. So influencers are the children of social media, the progeny of social media platforms, and perpetual self-promotion is foundational to their practices. So, and just as financial markets, especially derivative markets, rely on calculations of future value and thrive on a certain degree of volatility, so too do social media platforms. The more unique and unpredictable and authentic the creator content, the better for the platform's proprietary algorithms to learn and grow, thereby enhancing their profitability. But while content diversity and innovation might be summoned by the platforms, the metrics and the forms of reputational valuation that are attributed to the creator content produces a kind of performative reactivity in turn. As sociologists Espeland and Sonder have showed, ranked or measured users increasingly orient themselves to the imagined demands of the metrics. In the case of content creators, it can be argued that this user reactivity results in more standardized content, which is more monetizable, more saleable. So I just want to be clear here, though, that I fully recognize that there's personal and collective value in content creation, and there's a lot of benefit to self-representation for marginalized groups especially. So I'm not diminishing the agency of creators. I'm simply trying to account for the ways in which the political economic orientation of a maturing influencer industry and the platforms on which it operates align. And they can have significant subjectivizing impacts, producing more rigid and generic forms of self-presentation and standards of self-worth too. So given that we're a decade or so on from the rise of the online influencer, and even longer from the consolidation of what Cunningham and Craig have termed social media entertainment, I want to argue that the recent proliferation of these content houses is indeed a sign of a maturing industry, with an accumulation of power and profit going steadily upwards to top-tier influencers and their agents. So from their origins in and around 2014, content houses have been variably founded, financed, and run. And to this day, their actual business models appear to vary widely. They're extremely opaque and they're difficult to track down. Like the multi-channel networks before them, they all draw on the highly mythologized ideal of communities of creators who simply want to share and feed off each other's ideas and concepts. And certainly in the case of 1600 Vine Street, there appears to have been an organic migration of Vine stars. So Vine was an earlier social media platform that doesn't exist anymore. There's a bunch of those stars just moved to this apartment complex, and they work to enhance their own reputational clout by pooling their resources and collaborating with each other to create content. Jake Paul's Team 10 house, however, was clearly always a part of Paul's efforts to expand his own brand proposition and business by scouting for young influencers and bringing them to live in the house with him to build this Team 10 brand identity. Tellingly, Team 10, whose business handle is 10-Digit Media, was subsumed under another business expansion in 2017 when Jake Paul formed a digital talent management company and content incubator called Team Dom, which was financed with over $1 million of finance capital by China's Dunhua Capital Group and 4 other venture capitalists. So Team Dom now oversees Team 10, which Paul sees more as an entertainment label, where he collects the content creators, the influencers, and their music and any other content they produce. And what he does as well is he takes, in order to live in the Team 10 house, Jake Paul takes 20% off the top of any money his influencers living in the house make, any profit they make. So more recent content houses, such as Hype House, Sway House, and Clubhouse, have all publicly insisted on their organic origins. And they're all fronted by top-tier influencers, but they're also all underwritten and financed by digital talent management companies like WME, TalentX, and Influences, and also by digital media venture capitalists like UTA Ventures and Box Group. So as far as I've been able to discern, houses have different output requirements. Some are more stringent than others. So Hype House, for example, states that each of its members must post 3 to 4 videos a day, and others report having to post 8 different pieces of content daily. Some houses have explicit ongoing brand deals, like a brand might come in and sponsor a room in the house or the whole house for a period of time. Others offer related career development and opportunities to the influencers in the house. In some houses, participants work on commission. Other participants pay out a percentage of their earnings to house investors. Some must pay rent but are offered an equity stake in the house brand, while others, like Phase or Clout House, simply offer free rent in return for tenants contributing to the collective output. But while there appears to be a great deal of variety in terms of the business models and contractual relationships in these houses, clearly the overarching power of the management companies betrays an industrial hardening of the influencer community. The houses offer opportunities to the participants, to be sure, but only under very strict terms, as the management agencies control the living and working conditions and production demands, utilizing the houses as launching pads, not just for brand partnerships, but also for merchandising, for product and intellectual property deals, for live events, for television and film development, and of course, real estate promotion. So in the midst of what one TikTok influencer's parent has called this predatory environment, at least 2 houses have collapsed following claims that their management agency made unreasonable output demands and had the utilities turned off to punish what she saw to be unproductive tenants. So there's a lot more to be discovered about what kinds of contracts influencers sign in order to live in or be affiliated with these houses and how these deals are made. But as with much that's happening in the influencer marketing space, these details are generally kept secret. So content houses, so far at least, are populated by a surprisingly homogenous group of top-tier influencers. They're white, they're young, they're middle class, they're generally cisgendered. Indeed, the houses themselves betray a remarkable uniformity. So the houses are similar, standardized, white, stark, opulent LA mansions with pools and grounds filled with toys and art, perfect for Instagram pics and TikTok backdrops. And from what I've seen, the content that the houses produce is pretty bland and generic as well. TikTok dances, stunts, pranks, hanging out with pets, eating. This is most likely due to the promotional mission of these houses in general, where you're not actually producing sponsored posts or branded content. Influencers in the houses are working to hype their own house brand and demonstrate to potential clients that they can be reliably relied upon to provide predictable, inoffensive content. A widely circulated pitch deck from the now defunct Girls in the Valley house underscores this generic orientation of these houses. It positions the house as a creator collective that's dedicated to empowering women, claiming that the house offers its influencers access to some of the biggest names in the entertainment industry. The house itself is sold as having, quote, bright colors and a unique design that can be updated regularly to, quote, coincide with brand partnerships. So brands can come in and redo the house any way they want to. The deck goes on to list its stable of influencers, some of whom are members, others recurring guests, their collective demographics and reach, and potential sponsorship opportunities. So you can see here that the goal is to be as malleable but as also unique as possible. So the promotional orientation of the houses doesn't stop, too, at the doors of the mansion. However, there's an abundance of dramatic and romantic storylines that's generated within and between the houses as well. Of course, Logan and Jake Paul were among the first influencers to exploit this attention-getting potential of intergroup, inter-influencer drama. But the tradition continues apace with high-profile, for example, house defections and legal disputes, romantic storylines, connections, breakups, fights, threats to expose the bad behavior of one influencer from one house, and run-ins with the law. For example, 2 members of Sway House were arrested while in Mexico on drug charges, and the house had the power cut off and 2 of its members fined for breaking emergency pandemic orders and noise violations. So most of this inter-house drama has been marketized as content, of course, either through house-generated posts, diss tracks, or via gossip paratexts such as the Shade Room or the Hollywood Fix. And there's just a million drama sites online that keep track of influencer relationships. Notably, the bad press for the houses doesn't appear to have impacted these top-tier influencers' bottom lines. Most have kept their brand deals intact. Sway House even got an entirely new all-in investor, which was TikTok rival platform Triller. So as Talent X Vice President Michael Sensor has said, Sway House has, quote, generated a significant amount of revenue for these guys and our business. So it's hard to say that it wasn't worth it. The ultimate goal, of course, of these kinds of performative, promotional storylines and drama is to generate interest in reality television deals, which many of these houses are trying to get off the ground now. So, just to start wrapping up, from the carefully crafted promotional content and collaborations to the lives and relationships playing out within and between the different houses, to the houses themselves, which are often display homes that realtors are more than happy to rent out to these people for the visibility, to the toys and the furniture and the meals and the food that's furnished them. As businesses, content houses are thoroughly financialized, relying on a promotional value chain all the way down, including, and perhaps most importantly, the talent management companies that underwrite the houses. Indeed, along with the growing number of influencers of all types, mom-fluencers, fit-fluencers, sport-fluencers, beauty-fluencers, and sizes, micro-influencers, nano-influencers, top-tier influencers, and given all the ways that these influencers can make money, so that includes brand sponsorships, branded merchandise, app marketing, live streaming, music marketing, to name just a few, there's been a parallel growth and explosion in the number of talent agencies and management companies that are working to represent them. Business Insider recently enumerated 19 prominent talent agencies and management companies in LA alone that are currently vying to shape the careers of TikTok stars and social media influencers. Companies such as A3 Artists, UTA, ICM, WME are already well-established entertainment talent and management agencies that have begun to invest heavily in signing influencers through their digital and commercial departments. Other companies such as Fanbytes, Outshine Talents, and Viral Nation are digital marketing companies that have branched out into influencer talent management. And still others, such as Sandowski Enterprises and Jake Paul's Team Dawn, were founded by influencers themselves and have become talent incubators and management companies. So while it used to be that digital talent agents were ancillary or marginal, they're becoming more and more prominent in the talent and management industry overall. And many of these agencies represent both sides of the deals that they put together. They rep the brands and they rep the influencers, and they take a cut on both sides of those deals. So there's a lack of standardized employment terms. There's a lack of clear rates. Everybody sets their own rates. There is no unionization. So this space of business is a golden opportunity for talent and marketing agencies. As Alison Berman, the co-head of digital talent at UTA, says, it's the Wild West. Our area of business isn't templatized. We're entrepreneurial, and we're pioneering as we go. So given this context, we can see agencies madly working to exploit this Wild West of influencer culture by expanding and enclosing their influencer holdings in and through these content houses. So while with the houses, they can create a potential media brand out of the identity of the house itself and simultaneously kind of lock down and control the creators in the house. The political economic significance of these houses then isn't that they're some kind of innovative grassroots effort to enhance output by entrepreneurial top-tier influencers, but rather that by acting as front-facing branded content distribution hubs, they work to extend and amplify the control of the fast-growing, highly competitive digital talent management and representation talent agencies themselves. So that industry of digital marketing and digital talent management, of course, are blended together. And this is really where we can find the significance of these houses. So just to sum up, in 1994, screenwriter Catherine Turney described the Paramount studio in the 1940s as a city unto itself. When you were in it, you were enclosed like a cocoon, in another world completely. In a 2020 Today Show interview, Hype House member Thomas Petru compared the Content House experience to, quote, living in a movie set. It never stops. Both of these quotes describe emergent creator workplaces, sites of capitalist enclosure and value extraction. And to be sure, there are productive comparisons to be made between these new content houses and the old Hollywood studio system. Just to leave you with one comparison, where the vertically integrated Hollywood studios owned their contract players' body and soul, training them in groups to be stars and controlling every aspect of their public persona and their relationships. Influencer talent and marketing management companies train influencers to make brand-worthy promotional content in socialized creator collectives, lock participants down contractually, commodify their social lives, and by doing so, and like the Hollywood studios before them, secure the majority of the profits. Okay, well, so that's it for me. I want to thank everybody. I'm going to stop my share now. Thank everybody for listening, and I'm looking forward very much to your questions. Thanks so much.
Muchas gracias, Alison, por esa interesante presentación. A continuación, tendremos una conversación, incluyendo las preguntas que han dejado en el chat durante estas presentaciones. Les recuerdo que esta sesión de preguntas y respuestas las realizaremos en inglés, lo que significa que pueden apretar el icono de interpretación que está aquí abajo en sus pantallas por Zoom para acceder a la traducción del inglés al español. Después de esta presentación de Alison, me gustaría darles la bienvenida a Alison Hearn y a David Craig para que comencemos esta ronda de preguntas. Hi, David. Good to see you. How are you?
I'm good. Very good. Thank you.
Hi, David. Hi, Arturo.
I'm even better, Allison. That was bow down. Fantastic. Fantastic. We should take this on the road. It was a
I know. We do a group thing.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I can't wait to read more. It's been really amazing. I'm just amazed at how current and relevant your work is. It's just
Thank
I'm
you.
sitting here with my jaw open thinking, yes.
Maybe you can help me track down some contracts.
Oh, I'll have to work on that. Yeah. It is the coin of the realm. They're very, very hard to get. Yeah.
So true.
Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Social Media Culture Conference, and thanks for your presentations. They both were really, really interesting, and I would like to share some questions with you. Some trying to reach different topics. I would like to talk about your presentations and some issues you both raised through detailed analysis of the practices and activities of digital content creators. I would like to start this conversation with a question Alison mentioned in her presentation. In this global context, facing uncertain futures through a set of challenges in dimensions related to democracy, public health, environmental crisis, uncertain futures, no? How do we trust each other? I'm thinking on this question based on this style of communication promoted by influencers, which is authentic, calibrated in different ways, but at the same time hyper-commercial. I'm also thinking, for instance, of gig workers in the gig economy, Uber drivers, for instance, who also have to display a style of communication where the customer is always right, you know, in order to receive a good qualification from customers. Academics sometimes also use that style of communication, no, in order to reach new audiences, in order to validate themselves in front of different people, no? Can you both expand on the cultural challenges of this form of communication? I think it's quite interesting to discuss the consequence of this type of communication across markets, across culture, across social relations. I don't know who wants to start discussing this issue.
Allison?
Maybe you, Alison, you should
Well,
start.
I'm curious about what David has to say from his experience in China. But, you know, obviously this is a set of concerns that I have, you know, that motivates my own work. And I think you mentioned academics having to self-promote, and I'm lucky enough to be old enough to have watched that trend sort of take hold, and I see it in my younger colleagues and students. And that's when I said in my talk that, you know, everyone in a way is now forced into this, these practices of like staying relevant, of and as academics, you know, promoting your work. Journals will encourage you to do that. And it didn't, you know, obviously I've lived through that place of it not having to be the case that you did that and you did your work, you published it somewhere and it would circulate. And if it did, you were lucky and whatever, you kept trying. But I don't know, it feels like it always has felt like an extra layer of work. But I think it's important to keep in mind, and I sort of flagged this in my own presentation, and people like David and others who really are on boots on the ground in terms of looking at these communities remind me all the time that there is a lot of upside to this sort of form of self-presentation and self-representation. But I can't help it. That's the way my brain goes. I'm always just sort of thinking about what can it mean? Like you said, and I've said, and Andy Wernick was really the first person I read who raised this question. What can it mean for us to communicate with each other if we're always doubting or questioning the motives of the other online? I maybe am the only, or one of the only people who have a problem with it. I don't know. But I'm curious about what David has to say, because he's on the ground in China, and it's clearly this form of self-presentation and participant creation or content creation is serving a lot of other purposes beyond just economic.
So ironically, I'm going to assume a far more dystopian and critical position around this, which is that I find that the pervasiveness of this sort of demand on personal sociality and how it has been linked into all forms of commerce and activity in capitalist life is becoming burdensome and overwhelming. Although I am old, I am new to academia, and I have been seeing how this sort of performativity on social media has come with great consequence, including backlash that has created dire circumstances for my colleagues who may have said or took a position around things. So this is not something limited to these industries that we're mapping. When I look at what's happening in China specifically, as that's my topic today, although we've been mapping this industry globally and within China, a couple of things stand out for me. One is that the first generation of creators in this space were, in fact, people who had a reputation, who had already built a career, and they saw social media as an opportunity to engage directly with their viewers, their audiences, their fans, and to expand their public lives and influence into this sphere more powerfully than they have been able to do within the very limited conditions that were afforded by deeply regulated, state-driven Chinese media. So when you compared those set of circumstances, it was fascinating that academics, public intellectuals, politicians, as well as celebrities and talent, creative talent, migrated onto these platforms very quickly, which is quite different from outside of China, where it's been mostly young people who've been basically grown, they're native to the platforms, and they emerged, these were their first interactions with media. And it was those generations older than them who kind of looked at this media with a little bit of contempt and censor and confusion, and not just still struggling. I mean, just look at what's going on in Congress right now, where they don't have a clue what social media does. And this is 15, hearings later. But there's no question that we are pushing the boundaries of Goffman's understanding of everyday presentation, which is, of course, going back to Shakespeare. All the world is a stage. We're all performing. And the question is how do we navigate and balance these conditions of trying to influence, persuade, and encourage people to engage with us as humans, as well as our ideas, as well as the services that we have to provide, as well as our knowledge. And how far do we stretch that before it appears that we never leave the stage? Or in fact, we've taken all these cameras now backstage, and there's no longer any division and break between our online and offline lives, which is a topic that has been engaged by scholars now for 15, 20 years. It's a really difficult one. What I have, the only other glimmer of hope, I would say, is that I have found that the next platform generation, meaning the current generation going onto these platforms and seeing these as means of communication, interactivity, and commerce, have come to carve out separate offline lives and to value that in a deeper, more meaningful way, which is quite counterintuitive in an odd way. So now you have instances where young people literally will develop these events where they aren't allowed to bring their phones. There's the challenge to not pick up the phone while they're eating dinner, and whoever does has to pay for the dinner. There's the rise in non-digital games, card games and board games now. And a lot of that is because this now next generation is starting to understand the value. And I do believe after this horrific year, and who knows how long this pandemic occurs, that value for the corporal, where one can be more relaxed and not feel like they're constantly being recorded and having to perform, will be of even heightened value to us. So we'll see. I'm just eager for this whole pandemic to go away and we can reset and see what the world looks like when we emerge from our homes.
Yeah, definitely. I would like to make some connections between your work. From creators' perspective, for instance, their activities are sometimes uncertain. There are no unions, work contracts. They depend on platform algorithms, adapting their subjectivities to the evolution of platforms, for instance. What kind of future you both imagine for these actors? What type of research we need to do to resolve this kind of asymmetries of power these actors face against platforms, but also to explore and understand in depth the asymmetries they can facilitate through their content, through their representations. I would like to know what do you think about actors' subjectivities, no? Considering your talks.
I think that I love David's answer, and I think that one of the ways that we can think about the way that this economy is evolving is to look at it structurally, which is more my orientation. When you come to understand what the business models of these platforms are, which is data extraction, data sales, and it's very difficult to see content creation, especially as it's involved in the figure of the influencer, as anything other than a kind of front-facing personalizing of those same logics, because it's all about constant participation, constant summoning of others. It's like they're the salespeople for, besides all the brands they might rep, they are the salespeople for the logics of these platforms themselves, which is just constant availability, constant participation, constant communication to keep the data flowing. There have been, and there are other great scholars, my own student, Vicky O'Mara, who is working on forms of content creator resistance. So things like on Instagram, things like comment pods, where groups of Instagrammers will form as collectives to try to game the algorithm, to push the algorithm in each other's favor. It's a kind of drop in the bucket in a certain way, because obviously the algorithms are completely opaque to most people. Most people have no idea how they operate. But these comment pods are groups of influencers who have bonded together to try anyway to enhance their visibility and therefore their commodifiability or their potential, their ability to make money. So I think we can look at it like that. David could tell us more about the efforts to unionize or to organize across the content creator space. I know a little bit about it. I know it hasn't been that successful. I know that there are efforts right now in the UK to try again. But the ultimate question for me in relation to these issues of like, if we perceive these content creators as workers, entrepreneurial or not, their working conditions are set by the platforms. The platforms determine how they work, how visible they are, how they profit. And yet, of course, as usual with these platforms, they'll just sort of step back and go, oh, we're not really, like we're not news companies, we're not whatever, but they're setting the terms and conditions of work. But I think the problem with organizing across the influencer content creator space is, first of all, it's so variegated. There's so many different tiers of money making. And also it's such an individualized practice. It's like, how can you ask these people to think collectively, like you must do if you're in a union, to think about collective power when the whole ideology of the position, the subject position, is so hyper individualized and hyper personalized. Like it's you're the product, you're selling the product. So it's difficult to think, well, I have anything in common with this influencer, that influencer, which is why the collab houses, for me, the content houses are such kind of interesting efforts to align people. Anyway, I can go on, but I'll let David answer. Say more.
You said it. So there's two different types of organizing that Allison alluded to. One is the collectives. So that whether it's like the Instagram compods or the hype houses are literally the second generation of this attempt by creators to come together. The first generation was what were called multi-channel networks. And there were groups like Full Screen and I'm just blanking, because they rose up in around 2009, in part because YouTube funded them. And they came together as groups of creators to help pool their resources, to create more power and influence in an attempt to not only secure more revenue, but also to start to ask that the platforms recognize them. One of the reasons why the short video platform Vine collapsed is because they could not figure out a way to monetize their native creators on the platform. And those creators walked into those offices in a protest and said, you either pay for our content and our stakeholder, like treat us as stakeholders on the platform, or we're going to go down the street to Instagram, which now offered the same technology and affordances. And Vine said no and shut down. Which is really curious now that we're in the short video era of TikTok. So there's two forms of organizing bottom up. There's the bottom up attempt of organizing collectively with creators coming together across a platform or across verticals of contents like gamers or beauty influencers who are coming together to form groups like this British group of beauty influencers that are trying to come together and collectively get the platforms to treat them as stakeholders. Then there's the top-down state-driven model. And I find myself in a really curious position sitting here in the United States, of all places, which just seems to be going even further in the wrong direction, but trying to carve out a position that there's an economic argument for governments to recognize creators as stakeholders on these platforms and to force the platforms to treat them more equitably and fairly, not just platforms, but also advertising agencies. That there needs to be understood, and Arturo, you know all too well, because you and I are trying to find research funding in Latin America, because as we know, there are hugely successful, wildly successful creators that have emerged across Latin America. But Latin American governments have yet to step in and insist that the platforms be regulated in a way that acknowledges their creative labor and treats them fairly. Instead, what's happened is the opposite. They've allowed the platforms to basically pass along all the burdens and all the risk and all the consequences of anxieties that we have, very legitimate anxieties about what these platforms are doing to change culture and society. They end up passing that on to these creators instead of recognizing and giving these creators a seat at the table where they are also afforded certain protections. So I am very much, my colleagues and I are very much a part of what we would call a creator rights advocacy movement, which is to really understand and recognize that these creators are vital to the success of not only these platforms, but even more importantly, as we see from the Chinese example, vital to the success of creative economies, or you might call it creator economies. So we talk about the orange economy in Latin America. This, we believe, will be key drivers to the success of the creator economies in Latin America. but not until we think governments come to understand these as vital stakeholders in this platform, in these platform economies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would like to share with you some questions from the audience. Very interesting questions. The first one, it's for you, David, from Patricio. It has been said that the development of the entertainment industry is in part consequence of the copyrights policies. What has been the approach to copyrights problematics in the Chinese case?
So one of the key distinctions of both the Wanghong industry and the larger social media entertainment industry outside of China is that it's not driven by IP control. It is not the case that these are people posting content on platforms that they then go about securing official recognition for intellectual property rights. In fact, many attempts by creators in the past to claim copyright around their content or their formats have actually been resisted by other creators, meaning you cannot declare that you own a certain style of content or a certain type or format or genre of content on these platforms. And the platforms themselves are very, very vague about who actually owns the rights to that content. Mm-hmm. But what's central and key to our understanding of these two industries, social media entertainment is everything outside of China and Wanghong is inside China, is the fact that that they are generating value off of their ability to bring together communities. It's the social aspect of these media platforms that allows them to enter into numerous business models and revenue streams. So in this instance, IP control in China is almost, in some regards, almost irrelevant to what's going on in this Wanghong industry. Although there is some overlap and it does occasionally collide, but for the most part, they're not creating intellectual property that is being licensed and controlled in that manner.
Thank you. There are more questions here for Alison and David. It is one from Samuel Ortiz. Regarding digital labor, do you think the wild Far West analogy of no law in which the powerful isolate and exclude the weaker, does it apply to agencies and influencers as well, Uber drivers or food delivery services? Is there kind of wild Far West in all of those markets?
You know, the question of digital labor and who and what and where to call someone a worker or not a worker has, been ongoing for many, many, many years now. And, I think it's in the case of influencers or content creators, it's an interesting thought experiment to think about. I think the temptation is to say they're just like Uber drivers or they're just like, food delivery people. But I think the more interesting question is, how are they not like them? The reality is if you're driving for Uber, again, the platform determines the conditions of your work. For me, it's a less vexed question. They are working for the platform. And they have to follow the platform's rules. And as you pointed out, Arturo, even when you're an Uber driver, there is a form of performative labor that goes into that because you live and die by your ranking and your rating online, and you get sent to jobs based on how good your consumer rating is. Just like consumers will, if you're a bad tipper or whatever, if you're using Uber Eats, you'll get someone on a bike delivering to you rather than someone in a car. The platform manages it all. Whereas I think the creators, of course, are spread across so many different platforms with so much different kind of content. They have way more control over what they create, how often they create, so I think that it's easier to think about them more as entrepreneurial workers for sure contracted workers, rather than, in my opinion, Uber drivers who are very clearly employees of Uber, whether they work for 3 hours a week or 30. So anyway, I think the Wild West in the influencer culture and the content creator culture, at least from what I know, and again, David is really the expert in terms of its sort of global formation, strikes me as just an opportunity for further enclosure. And as I said in the presentation, this movement of profit and attention and access to resources and other career opportunities upwards. Like you're trying to make it still. If you're a nano influencer, not everybody, but the logics, the mythology, and the way that it works is to continually try to amplify your capital, your metrics. I don't know if David would agree with that.
I completely agree. We are, it's like we prepared in advance. Yes, so I think it's vital that we make some distinctions between the gig economy and the creator economy. And to exactly your point, the gig economy is really just an excuse for using contracted labor without any of the privileges or benefits or security that comes with working for a company, and it's criminal. It really is criminal. The flip side is the creator economy has a different set of conditions that are equally as challenging, but different in the sense that they have, I would almost call, I think it's sometimes we slip into the use of the word labor in the context of working for someone. They work for themselves. Of course, platforms dictate a lot of the terms of service, as do the brands and the advertisers, but it is there's a great deal more agency in this regard. But the flip side of having more agency is also less formalized type forms of legal protections. So, increasingly, for example, when the Hollywood talent agencies sign their clients, the Hollywood talent agencies themselves are regulated by the California government, which is interesting, the state government. And there are a lot of provisions around what they can and cannot do in terms of negotiating deals and what percentage of fees they're allowed to take. But increasingly, all of those lines have become very blurred between what talent representatives do and talent managers do, and these collectives of multi-channel networks and hype houses are doing. There still needs to be the downside, I would say, is, the risk of formalization, which happens with every creative industry. As it matures, it introduces all sorts of kind of bureaucratic structural conditions that are often well-intended to try to help kind of constrain and wrestle the wildness down, is that it also tamps down and has a risk of discouraging entrepreneurialism. Because what has happened over the last 15 years of this industry is that the creators themselves are often the ones who craft the new business models. And then the platforms usually follow behind 3 to 5 years later and integrate those business models onto their platforms because they want to keep the creators from leaving. So this pattern of constant creative destruction, if you will, in a Schumpeterian kind of way, it has been vital to the success of these creators. They're constantly having to migrate to new business models as the industry comes in and often subsumes and tamps down some of their benefits and their proceeds. So the question is whether or not this is a finite kind of development. My experience coming from Hollywood is that it never stops. It's a constant churn. It's the rate and speed with which this disruption continues to happen seems to go even faster all the time.
And I'd just like to jump into to go back a little bit to Arturo's question earlier about like the fallout or the lifelong, the sort of the lifespan of influencers. And when we were talking about the bigger questions about selfhood and self-presentation, there's a whole genre of videos on YouTube, and this, I really want to write a paper about this, is our burnout videos, are videos of YouTubers who confess to their followers that they're burnt out, they can't keep doing it anymore, they're working all the time, they can't manage it, and, or they're taking a break or whatever. And I think those kinds of, and then, when you look at the average age of the influencers in these content houses, and the amount of money that they have and attention and fame, et cetera, that's being sort of foisted on them so fast. And, and then the kind of reckless decisions that they make. And I think the idea of it being a predatory environment is actually true when you consider that many of these TikTokers are below the age of consent, and they're often accompanied there by their parents. It can't help but remind you of the studio system in the 30s and 40s, and even like the child star, the figure of the child star in those early years of the Hollywood studio system. So, or even Disney now, right? Disney's child stars that they kind of lock in contractually and dictate what clothes they can wear publicly and who they are fake dating, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same logic of control, but I think the fallout is, I thought of it when David was talking about the churn, right? Like the constant creative creation and destruction and the speed of that churn, where I can't think of it except as people. These are people who are being kind of churned through the system, right? And they may achieve some longevity, but they're inevitably not going to be able to maintain it, and they'll fall off the radar, become less relevant, yada, yada. So these are people's lives that we're feeding into this mill of the influencer culture. And I think that's something, and I think it has serious consequences, not to be moral panicky about it, but just to point out that structurally, inevitably, it's going to, because the work burden is really difficult to manage.
Yeah, that's an interesting example now of that situation, and also I would like to maybe ask you both about this kind of continuity, between, in your case, David, you have in-depth knowledge about the Hollywood industry, and you, Alison, finished your presentation talking about Hollywood, and the way they exploit value in some ways from different individuals and their activities. So what's new in this kind of influencer industry or economy, considering that we can find different examples of value creation and value exploitation from industries, companies, intermediaries, issues of self-presentation and self-management and visibility as well. What do you think it's the new aspect or the new dimension of this kind of visibility and exploitation and commerce around your own content, your own brand, and your own visibility?
All right. Well, I would say it would be both in the scale and in the breadth of diversity of cultural producers that are afforded the opportunities to enter into this space. And I'll just offer up my own anecdotal example, which is that as I was on my way to doing what has now reached 300 interviews in this space over the last 5 years, it was a kind of fascinating to realize that half of the creators that we had interviewed in many verticals, beauty, game, children's unboxing, information, education, all these different types of content that performed very well in this space, half of them turned out to be Asian American. And that was a shock to realize that the leaders in those categories were Asian Americans and have been for over a decade. When in fact, in Hollywood, we were just celebrating the success of one Asian American movie that had managed to become a global success. We were just celebrating one Asian American sitcom that had become a success on television. In this space and in this venue, Asian Americans have been crazy rich Asian Americans for the last 15 years, Michelle Phan and Ryan Higa and Markiplier and EvanTube. It just kept going on. And you suddenly realize that this has opened up a space for cultural producers who are securing not only commercial careers, but increasingly what we also discovered is that while it was not their intention to become either role models or activists for their communities, it became clear to them there was a kind of an activist trajectory that aligned with their maturation as human beings, that they had a bit of a responsibility to the communities that they represented, because if they behaved in irresponsible ways, they would lose that community and then lose their commercial value. So these two things suddenly became very twined. So you saw, for example, the other category that we witnessed, which was also of great shock and fascination to me, was the success of LGBTQ creators in this space. Also, many of whom were doing extremely well, when that sort of representation, while definitely improved a great deal in Hollywood, is still being dictated by the networks and the producers and the writers and showrunners. Here, these were queer creators who were creating communities around and interested in their queerness that turned into commercially viable operations. But I would say that the most fascinating, if still very nascent research that we've done has been around Arab-speaking and Muslim belief communities with young people who have never found themselves represented, not in Western media, but in Arab-speaking media. There is very little youth representation in Arab-speaking media that they identify with. And they have built this huge, massive online community in this industry that has afforded them the means to not only support themselves and their families, but also to start to identify with a modern cosmopolitan Arabness and Muslim beliefs, where they are slowly going about influencing the larger community and the global community to advocate for more progress and moderation. And it was a real shock. What's even more fascinating is a lot of them are actually based in Detroit, in Michigan, which has the second largest Arab-speaking community outside of the Middle East. So it's one of many instances. So that's where I would say that's the value that's operating here. And of course, as I mentioned, you have Latin American creators. The biggest Latin American creators in Colombia are a lesbian couple, Calle y Pollo. And what they've done to advocate and promote and live their lives as an open lesbian couple in what has been a fairly religious and let's just say less tolerant society, has so rapidly advanced LGBTQ representation in Colombia that you now have the mayors of the cities now are open lesbians and getting elected to office. So you're seeing just rapid transformation culturally, as well as growing influence commercially by these creators who would otherwise never have found a place within legacy traditional media industries.
Thanks, David. Alison, do you want to comment on that question, or I continue?
I think David did a great job. I mean, I think David's answer really points out how complex the sort of set of questions that the rise of content creation presents to us. Because, and again, I think that we can look to these older models in the sort of traditional Hollywood studio system, for example, and MCNs, multi-channel networks, as David mentioned. You know, they're not that old, but they're an earlier model of collaborative content creation. But we can look to them as sort of cautionary tales or earlier evidence of the way in which whatever sort of really fabulous creative and social potential might inhere in content creation, as David was just describing, in terms of changing the political discourse or empowering underrepresented groups. you know, if you take the position of the autonomista, you know, the Marxist, autonomous Marxists, from their point of view, capital is always lagging behind the worker, right? I mean, it's that the people will innovate and people will insist on producing and creating and innovating, and capital is always trying to capture. But it's never a complete process of capture. There's always excess. And, you know, we could have a debate for the Marxists in the group about your position on this class struggle Marxism. But I think what David just described is an example of at least the really deep tensions between the availability of these platforms and these forms of self-representation that can have like important upsides. But I think we can look at these older models of the creative industries and the way in which they can lock down, enclose, as David said, you know, really enforce a kind of conformity and lock people out as cautionary tales, as things to pay attention to. I mean, history, always important, always historicized. So that would be my point about looking at them.
Thank you, Alison. There's a couple of more questions. Matthias asks, how can be understood the efforts in the United States trying to divide platforms that work as digital monopolies, but in China, the platforms accumulate more functionalities and still you say the markets seem more competitive? That's for David.
Yes. So if we understand the core concept of platform capitalism, it's that it always gravitates, as capitalism does, towards a monopolization of control over that entire industry by a small handful of corporations. And it seeks to lock out competition. That has played out exactly in the Silicon Valley context. So all of these platforms, whether it's Facebook and Instagram, Twitter and Periscope, Amazon, Twitch, they're all very eager to become in and of themselves walled gardens, which is ironic because that's the term that we use to describe the Chinese firewall as a walled garden. But within the Chinese walled garden, all of the plants and the flowers are all pollinating one another. And it has created an even more diverse, rich, collaborative, and competitive landscape of platforms, which the government itself has continued to advance. In fact, just this week, the government came down with a series of antitrust regulations to prevent platforms from going the same direction as Silicon Valley. They want these platforms to continue to be collaborative. And the idea is that it raises all boats and it allows all of these platforms to foster and grow. Now, the truth is that it's still a capitalist model. So you are still going to witness, for example, companies like Tencent, instead of trying to do what the West has done in terms of controlling entire platform economies, which they've managed to do in some regards with their platform WeChat. WeChat is referred to as a super app because you can literally conduct every type of online activity just on the app alone. But Tencent is very much modeling after the Silicon Valley model of trying to corner the market. They want to control the global game industry. They have the largest publishing. They own most of the game streaming platforms in China now. They bought the two biggest ones and are now in the process of merging them. They're also trying to corner the market on streaming video platforms. So they not only own Tencent Video, but they have now purchased controlling share of iQIYI, which means, and they're trying to merge these together. So you are seeing the same pattern of capitalist agglomeration, conglomeration, oligopolistic, monopolistic control happening in China. And what's interesting is that in this instance, the state is aggressively trying to keep this from happening, knowing that to do so would end up hurting their economy, which is so dependent upon those platforms. So whereas in the West and in the US, we keep having these ridiculous hearings in Congress with people who don't even understand what a social media platform is, much less realizing that there's all this creator-based entrepreneurialism happening on there, completely incapable of enforcing or coming up with laws that would promote this sort of that would take these platforms and take them apart and do antitrust measures because they've absolutely become far too powerful and agglomerative. China's state policy has been very aggressively resisting those conditions because it would only end up hurting the larger economic progress that they've been making.
Thank you, David. Alison, Ana Jorge, who is a scholar, commented here, I have a paper coming out next year on influencers' content on social media and digital detox. They are self-regulating and inviting audiences to do the same, reinforcing your comment. Well, there are so many questions, but I think I would like to acknowledge and say thank you to both David and Alison for this great conversation and very insightful and smart, and thanks for your time. I would like to thank to the audience, the people who participate. This is our last day of the conference. We started on Monday. And this is the last day, so thank you so much. Muchas gracias a todos los que participaron. Muchas gracias también al equipo que pudo realizar y llevar a cabo todo este trabajo en la conferencia, a todo el equipo de la Escuela de Comunicaciones y Periodismo de la Universidad de Adolfo Ibáñez. Muchas gracias. Pueden revisar el trabajo de investigación que hacemos en la escuela sobre estos temas en nuestros sitios web. Pueden revisar también la conferencia. Todos estos videos van a ser públicos en algunos días para que puedan volver a verlos, y esperamos que tener otra versión de este evento el próximo año. Thank you so much, David and Alison, again. Good to see you, good to read your work. I'm always grateful for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to share with you this time and this possibility to think about your work. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias a todos, que estén muy bien. Nos vemos el 2021, esperamos.